All right, here's our last lesson for the Civil War unit, Gettysburg Address to the end of the war, final battles. Need to understand some of the significance of some of these battles that you see listed here in the Union war effort. And when we get into class, we're not going to necessarily have you do it for homework and home learning right here now, but in class we're going to take a look at the Gettysburg Address and the significance of 1863 and the events that happened on that date, and the connection of the Gettysburg Address to previous events and what's coming up in the near future, in the end of the war, 1865. In the winter of 1862 and 63, it's still pretty gloomy for the Union. The battles are getting bigger and bigger by the week, by the day, by the month. Fredericksburg, Virginia, which is very close to Washington, D.C., falls. The casualties are massive in all these battles, and they just get bigger right to the very end of the war. We have resignations of generals again yet, reappointments of new generals for the Union Army by Lincoln. Can't find a guy that fights, and the people are dying so fast that they can't be buried fast enough. It's well after the Civil War that the final remains of many people are found in the woods and in swamps and things like that to be finally buried, and many freed slaves are actually doing a lot of the work of burying the dead. A ghastly event, highly traumatic for the country, obviously. In 1863, Lee still seems to be unbeatable. He wins a major battle at Chancellorsville, Virginia, and the star signifies where Washington, D.C. is. However, it's Stonewall Jackson, one of the big heroes and best generals of the war. According to Lee, his right arm or right-hand man being cut off with his death is how he put it. Dies and is actually killed by friendly fire in that particular battle. And you can see in Virginia there's a heavy number of battles right around Virginia and Washington, D.C. I'll show you another map that kind of highlights the intensity of battles in Virginia. It is really a fight in between the two capitals. End of the war, despite Southern victories at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, the main idea here really is that the tide of the war turns in the summer of 1863 when the North wins at Gettysburg in the east and Vicksburg in the west. General Meade meets Lee's Confederate troops near Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and this is the only battle to occur on free, non-slave northern soil, and this is an attempt to basically disrupt the northern public sentiment, to put a scare into the public, to discredit Lincoln's ability to defend the North from the South. His army marches through Virginia, up through West Virginia, particularly today, and into this small town right across the border into Pennsylvania to try and gain a significant victory and maybe get the North to come to terms or to sit down and agree to terms to end the war. And maybe that would also help with Britain and France coming into the war. The South had some hopes of that yet, but it wasn't really going to happen. There's a 3-day battle that goes on here. It's one of the biggest, most largely studied battles in all of military history. And on the last day, there's this all-out attack that is waged to try and bring it to an end in a victory for the South, and it fails, and it fails by a hair, and it is the final event of this battle. It's by far the dwarfs all of the casualties of all the other battles that had previously occurred. If you go there, there are monuments as to what unit from what state was where and when and what they did and who did what there. It's heavily marked out and identified in terms of how the battle went. It's farm country across open fields. Future President Dwight D. Eisenhower actually has his farm near there, but it is unbelievable in terms of the human cost of life in all this. But it is a Union victory, and a Union victory that sends the Southern Army of Lee back to the South, who are really not pursued yet again. The Union did not chase them down. Lincoln wasn't too happy about that. But this battle is considered to be also the high water mark of the Confederacy. It was never as threatening to the security of Washington, D.C. and to the North as it was up until this time. After this, it's going to be kind of downhill, and the Union war effort, the Union military machine, the armies are getting bigger and bigger all the time. It's going to amass to an army of about 2+ million soldiers by the end of the war. And when we get in class, hold off on this. I did not assign this for home learning yet. For home learning, we'll do this in class. We'll take a look at Gettysburg Address, and we'll take a look at the significance of that, and talk about it in relationship to the Union goal. What's Lincoln's goal? How does Lincoln's goal fit? Has Lincoln's goal changed in all this? And there is a picture of Lincoln giving that Gettysburg Address. Also, the same day, on July 4th, 1863, the end of Gettysburg is that day. The end of Vicksburg out in the west is that day. And this is the other major battle that helps solidify a piece of the Anaconda Plan in the war. And this is, as you can see here, where Vicksburg is on the top of the map on the left. It's right in the middle. New Orleans was taken by Farragut in 1862. Shiloh up here kind of solidified with Grant's win at Shiloh here at the upper reaches of the Mississippi River, and gradually to the north worked their way up the river and to this particular river town, Vicksburg, that was kind of the linchpin that would finally give the Union the control of everything and all the flow up and down the Mississippi River. Oops, going wrong direction there. This was a siege kind of a battle, and that meant basically the town was entirely surrounded by land and on the river. This new piece of shipping technology, these ironclad boats, became the norm at this point in time. This is a major transition in military naval history in the world. They start making these boats out of steel and iron, and they're layered with iron so that cannonballs bounce off of them. And these ships floated up and down the river, bombing the city. The city was being bombed from the land and surrounded by Grant's forces out there in the west. People got into basically a mode of starvation, and they had to dig holes and caves into the hillsides and into the ground to survive. People were eating horses and whatever they could find to survive. And finally, again, on that 4th of July, 1863, the river falls, and the Anaconda Plan on the Mississippi River is a success. And from here, one of the other top generals in the West that was part of Grant's armies out there, a guy by the name of William Tecumseh Sherman, named after the great famous Native American chief Tecumseh, proposed a plan to invade the South. And it's after a victory here in Chattanooga, Tennessee, which is a major river town in the South, that gives them more access into the South by river, that Lincoln finally is recognizing Grant as the guy he needs to continue the fight in the war, and he names him Union Supreme Commander, and he brings him out into the East. Can't spare that guy. He fights. So Sherman's new plan is to invade into the deep South by living off the land. Usually armies would have a supply line and a supply army supplying them, and they would only move as fast as their supply army could supply them and move along with them. Well, Sherman says, let's just break away and let's go ahead and live off the resources and the food of the South and destroy as much as we can. This is bringing a concept called total war to the people of the South. That means basically a war of societies, war to the people and the civilians. And he's going to basically march all the way through from Tennessee to Georgia, try to get to the ocean, to the sea, the Atlantic, and destroy everything along the way. He sends out bomber squads of soldiers with wagons and horses to basically take in all the food, raid the gardens, raid the canned goods, take the pigs, take the chickens, take the cows, whatever they had to eat, take it so the army could feed off of it, destroy railroads, destroy buildings along the way so that the civilians could not support the war effort in the South. And this would cause him to be one of the most hated, and right up next to Lincoln, Northerners in the entire war for the destruction that happens here. And what you see here is a young boy at a national park playing on something that would become known as Sherman's neckties. Google that on YouTube. You'll find a short video on how Sherman made these things and how they bent these rails so that they could not reconstruct the railroads that were in the South, which there weren't very many. They were minimal. And so that would be significantly debilitating for the military war effort in the South. So the idea is to make Georgia howl, make them feel a pain, the populace and all that kind of thing. By the time we get to December of 1864, which is an election year, an important year, and a very tense year for Lincoln, and an unsure year for Lincoln, he enters Savannah, Georgia, on the coast without a fight after having burned a good portion of Atlanta Atlanta, Georgia to the ground, and he sends a message to Lincoln saying, "For Christmas, here is Savannah." And then he continues his march from Savannah, as you can see over here on the coast at the bottom of the map, up into the Carolinas, and tries to split the Carolinas. So this was another part of the Anaconda Plan also, and that they were going to split the Confederacy in two at the Mississippi, but then they're going to split it in two geographically in this way, and now another way through the Carolinas. And this is really going to exhaust Southern troops and forces and disrupt Southern society itself. There's really no stopping this army at all. It's highly successful, but other major battles still continue. There's still a lot of resistance, and the fighting just is still intense through 1864 and continues into 1865. And again, this is, you can kind of see the route of Sherman through here, the intensity of fighting along the Mississippi River, and then especially in the Carolinas and Virginia, especially here in terms of battles waged in each of those years, color-coded. So the election in 1864 is a very tense year. It's an election year trying to run for a second win here for Lincoln and the Republicans, and they're very concerned that since the war has been so bloody and deadly and there hasn't been an end to it, that perhaps Lincoln will lose the war, because there's another voice in the North that's asking for peace. So the Republicans change their name. They actually become known as the Union Party for this election, and they choose Lincoln chooses a new vice presidential candidate to run with him. His name is Andrew Johnson. This guy is incredibly important to remember for the Reconstruction time period. He's a Democrat, of course, pro-Union Southerner, though Democrat. He would be known also as a war Democrat. He's the only senator from a Confederate state not to secede from the Union. I don't think this is in your notes, so you might want to add that. And one of the reasons why they're going to try and put him on the ticket is to gain a set of votes from a particular geographic area. And that area is the border states. Notice where Tennessee is. It is a Confederate state, but there's slavery there. He was a slave owner. We'll talk more about him a little bit later, but again, slavery still exists, if you remember, with our Emancipation Proclamation, in these border states. And so there's a mix of people voting there, and Lincoln needs their vote. He needs to win those states for the presidency, because there's a competitor on the other side from the Democratic Party that is trying to win that position as well. And his name is General George McClellan, who Lincoln has hired and fired at least twice, who is critical of Lincoln and the war effort, thinks Lincoln doesn't know anything, and Lincoln has directed him to do particular things in the field that he doesn't want or like to do, and has also ignored those things. So he's happy to oppose Lincoln for that reason. He's really admired and is respected by his soldiers. Soldiers love him, and Mr. Lincoln, the Republican, now the Union Party, is concerned that the soldiers in the military might even swing the other way. What better way to be done with the war than to vote for your commander who wants to end the war, and then you don't have to risk your life, correct? So here's McClellan in the middle, and he's being shown here as being the guy that's going to hold the Union together. Jefferson Davis on the right, Lincoln on the left, being the two tearing it apart. He's going to bring it back together again. And the Democrats under McClellan will paint Lincoln and the Republican Party as the party of African Americans, of slaves, trying to promote Negro equality, the idea that they're the same as whites. And that was a really unacceptable and an unsavory thing for Northerners to accept at that time. And I'm not going to fight and die, and I don't want this war to wage on for African American free slave equality. And we are the party of peace and union. We'll bring it back together. All right. And so these Democrats under McClellan become known as Peace Democrats, or Copperheads, and some of the members wore pennies around their necks. They're strongly opposed to the war. They blame the abolitionists for the war. They're the cause behind all of this. And they're demanding immediate peace. They're resisting draft laws. There's very violent draft riots in the North, especially in New York City. Had been a while back. There is a mandatory draft that the North establishes here during the war. And as you can see by the poster here on the right-hand side, that Lincoln is being identified as part of African Americans, or having African American blood in his heritage. So there's a lot of race being woven into this election and into the resistance to the war effort and the leadership of Abraham Lincoln, a tyrant, destroying American Republican values, despotism, expansion of his power as commander-in-chief, going too far. We'll talk about a few examples of that a little bit later on. Defying maybe even some of the powers of Congress. But there's no worries. The election won by Lincoln fairly solidly. Some things that helped this along. Some other battles on the battlefield kind of swayed the public toward, okay, the war is moving, we're progressing. Win for the Gulf of Mexico at Mobile Bay, Alabama by Admiral Farragut. The Union blockade is really solidly taking control now on the oceans and on the seas. Sherman takes Atlanta, as we saw before. That helped sway public opinion. And a guy by the name of General Sheridan drives Confederates out of the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia. And this Shenandoah Valley in Virginia is right about in here. And this is a place where a good amount of wheat and food type crops were made for the South that fed many of these northern armies. It's no longer in, northern armies, Confederate armies. It's no longer in Confederate control. The end of the war, or the last major battle of the war, not the last fight or at all in the war, but the last major battle in which Lee surrenders happens at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia in April 2nd, 1865. He's surrounded by troops led by Robert E. Lee and his army, of course, in the east. His officers suggest that maybe his army should split up into multiple pieces and parts and run into the Appalachian Mountains and continue to fight as guerrilla warriors, but Lee rejects it and said this is enough. This is the end. There's no sense to the war going on. They can't keep up with the war machine that's being built and growing by the day in the north, and he meets Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia to negotiate surrender terms, and they are: give up your arms, everybody goes home. If you have a horse, you keep your horses. You need that on the farms. It's an essential thing for living at that point in time. Still a heavily agricultural society. Everybody gets 3 days worth of food. And soon after, within several months, there are other skirmishes and there are other battles out in the far west and far reaches of the South where people just refuse to surrender. President Jefferson Davis runs and is trying to hide and run for his life. He's captured. But then the question becomes, now what? What should the South? What should we do with these Southern leaders? How do we punish them? What happens after the war with these traitors? And a little bit of a hint of this comes in Lincoln's second inaugural address on March 4th, 1865. Slavery has divided the nation, but we must bind up the nation's wounds with charity for all, with malice toward none, hatred or vengeance. With firmness in the right as God gives us, let us strive on to finish the work we are in. This is not really about punishment. It's about leniency. It's about forgiveness. Let's bring it back together. All right. And at this inaugural address, there's Lincoln right there. A guy by the name of John Wilkes Booth is right there listening to what he said, and there was even a hint in his second inaugural address of the status of African Americans, and that irritated him and many others. That's something to be left for the Reconstruction time period. Some key battles: Western Campaign, Eastern Campaign, a little bit of a timeline. Casualties and deaths, massive. 630,000 has long been the number, but even today, there may be thinking that the numbers were eclipsing 700,000 plus people dying, most of them because of disease, infections, things like that. But a massive portion of the population, and it eclipses nearly all other wars in U.S. history. And there's another little comparison. So that's the end of our unit. We'll get into some advantages and disadvantages and characteristics of the war next class, and an evaluation of the Gettysburg Address. Be ready for maybe a little assessment on this. Make hay. See you another day.